frangipani debt. The first lie I told myself was that the storm was natural. I stood in the heart of my villa, a monument of glass and steel I had carved out of the Khmer coastline. The air conditioning hummed a quiet tune of defiance against the oppressive Cambodian heat. Outside, the sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue just an hour before, was now the color of a day-old bruise. My name is Dara, though most people who work for me or want something from me call me Dara, a title bought with land, with concrete, with the relentless march of progress that flattened anything that stood in its way. I was a man of the new Cambodia, a man who believed in balance sheets and architectural blueprints, not in the ramblings of old village grandmothers. My villa was my sanctuary, my testament to that belief. Its walls were glass, floor to ceiling, offering an uninterrupted panorama of the Gulf of Thailand. It was a sterile, perfect box, designed to keep the chaos of nature at a comfortable, picturesque distance. But the storm wasn't staying at a distance. It had appeared from nowhere, a churning, purple fist on the horizon that swallowed the sun in minutes. The wind hit not with a roar, but with a low, gut-deep hum, a vibration that seemed to travel up from the foundations of the house and into the soles of my feet. It wasn't thunder that rode the wind. It was something else, a sound like 1,000 voices whispering the same mournful prayer all at once, just on the edge of hearing. I tilted my head, straining to make out words, but it was just a texture, a rhythmic, aggrieved pulse that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I dismissed it as the strange acoustics of the wind hitting the sharp angles of my modern home. Another lie. Then came the smell. It cut through the filtered, refrigerated air of my villa as if the walls weren't there. It wasn't just the clean, briny scent of the sea. It was thick, heavy, the cloying sweetness of jasmine so potent it was almost sickening. And beneath it, another scent, something dusty and sad, the smell of day-old incense. The kind you find at a small roadside shrine, its ashes scattered by the wind, its offering forgotten. It was a smell of abandoned devotion. I walked to the vast glass wall overlooking my private beach. The sand, usually a pleasant golden white, was dark with moisture. The waves were wrong. They weren't crashing and receding in their usual gentle rhythm. They were crawling. Black and oily under the bruised sky, they slithered up the sand inch by inch, unnaturally slow, unnervingly deliberate. They didn't retreat, they just kept coming. And with each crawling wave, a delivery. A single, perfect frangipani flower, ghost white with a delicate yellow heart. Each wave would push forward, its dark water curling like a tongue, and deposit one flower on the edge of my manicured lawn before sinking back into the sand. Another wave would follow, placing another flower a few feet away. I watched, mesmerized and disturbed, as a line began to form. A perfect, evenly spaced row of white flowers stark against the lush green grass. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a freak of the tide. It was a procession, an offering, or an accusation. I picked up my phone, my fingers feeling clumsy and thick. I needed to call someone, my site manager, the groundskeeper, anyone, just to hear another voice, a rational voice that would tell me this was some bizarre, explainable phenomenon. A red tide, a strange algal bloom, anything but what it felt like. What it felt like was personal. The whispering on the wind grew louder, the cadence becoming clearer. It sounded like a chant, a lament. The smell of jasmine and old incense was now so thick in my villa that my throat felt tight. I felt watched. The vast, open space of my minimalist home no longer felt like a symbol of freedom. It felt like a display case, and I was the specimen inside. Another wave crawled ashore, depositing another frangipani. The line was now stretching from the surf to the very edge of my infinity pool, a white carpet being unrolled for some unseen, unwelcome guest. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. The sterile cage I had built for myself, my fortress of modernity, had just become my prison. The whispering grew louder, and for the first time I thought I could almost make out a word, repeated over and over. A name. My name. Dara. The lights flickered once, twice, then died. I was plunged into the bruised twilight of the storm, with only the ghost white of the flowers on the lawn to light the world. The humming from the walls stopped, replaced by the suffocating sound of the whispering wind and my own ragged breathing. I stood there in the dark, a man of wealth and influence, utterly powerless. A king in a glass castle under siege by flowers and whispers. And I understood with a cold certainty that settled deep in my gut that this storm was not a force of nature. It was a force of memory, and it had come for me. The silence that followed the power cut was worse than the storm itself. It was a heavy, listening silence, the kind where you become painfully aware of the blood poolsing in your own ears. The whispering chant from outside seemed to have seeped through the glass, no longer a sound carried on the wind, but a murmur that lived in the corners of every room. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a lonely beacon in the gloom. I switched on its flashlight, the beam cutting a nervous, trembling path through the cavernous living area. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe. The polished marble floors reflected the distorted shapes of my expensive, soulless furniture. It all looked alien now, like artifacts from a life that was no longer mine. My mind, so used to dealing in logistics and profit margins, scrabbled for a foothold in logic. A localized atmospheric event, a pressure drop causing auditory hallucinations, the scent memory triggered by the ozone. I recited these possibilities like a mantra, but the words were hollow. They were prayers to a god of science that had abandoned this stretch of coast. The beam of my phone light swept across the glass wall. The lawn was a sea of white. There were hundreds of them now. Hundreds of frangipani flowers laid out with chilling precision. They no longer formed a neat line. They were arranged in a vast, sprawling spiral, its center point aimed directly at my front door. A cold dread, sharp and painful, pierced through my attempts at rationalization. This was a pattern. This was intent. I backed away from the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had to get out, but where would I go? Fleeing into that unnatural storm seemed like a worse fate than staying inside. My car was in the garage, but the electronic gates wouldn't work without power. I was well and truly trapped. Suddenly, a loud banging on the back door, the solid teak door that led to the staff quarters, made me jump so violently that I almost dropped my phone. Akhnadera. It was Ta Sorn, my old night watchman, a wiry, sun-weathered man from the local village, whose employment I'd continued mostly out of a sense of reluctant obligation. He was a relic, just like the superstitions he was always muttering about. I scrambled to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the deadbolt. I pulled it open, and Ta Sorn practically fell inside, drenched and shivering. His face, usually a mask of placid respect, was a canvas of pure terror. His eyes were wide, darting around the dark room as if he expected to see something standing behind me. Ta Sorn, what is happening? The storm, the power, I started, my voice strained. He ignored my questions, his gaze fixed on the glass wall overlooking the sea. He saw the spiral of flowers and a low moan escaped his lips. "It is her," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She has come." "She? Who is she? What are you talking about?" I demanded, my fear giving way to a spike of anger. I needed answers, not riddles. Ta Sorn finally looked at me, and his eyes held a terrible pity. "The Nikta Akhnha, the spirit of this shore. You built your house on her home." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. I remembered it then, a vague, irritating memory from the early days of construction. A small, weathered spirit house, no bigger than a birdhouse, nestled under an ancient banyan tree right where my infinity pool now shimmered. My foreman had told me the locals were uneasy about moving it. They said a powerful guardian spirit, a Nikta, resided there. I had laughed. I told him to offer the villagers a little money for their trouble and then have the bulldozer clear the entire plot. We had a schedule to keep. Progress couldn't wait for ghosts. "It was just an old tree and a pile of rotting wood," I said, the words sounding weak even to my own ears. "It was her anchor," Ta Sorn said, his voice barely a whisper. "She has been here longer than the sand, Aknha. She protected the fishermen. She calmed the waves. The people left her offerings. Jasmine, frangipani." He pointed a trembling finger towards the lawn. "Those are not gifts, Aknha. They are markers. Each flower is a memory. Each flower is a piece of a debt you must now pay." As he spoke, a new sound began, a faint scratching. It was coming from the glass wall facing the sea. I aimed my flashlight at the sound. My blood ran cold. On the outside of the glass, a handprint was forming. A small, delicate handprint appearing out of the rain and condensation. Then another, and another. They weren't crashing against the glass. They were pressing, gently, lovingly, as if caressing the transparent barrier that separated us. The whispers inside the house intensified, coalescing into a single, sorrowful female voice, humming a lullaby that had no comfort in it. "She wants to come in," Ta Sorn breathed, shrinking back towards the solid wall of the kitchen. "She thinks this is her house now." The scratching sound spread across the entire length of the glass wall. It was the sound of 100 fingernails lightly tracing patterns on the pane. The humming grew louder, the lullaby weaving itself into the rhythmic chant from the storm. The air grew impossibly cold, and the smell of jasmine became so overpowering that I gagged, my eyes watering. I looked at Ta Sorn, this simple old man I had always dismissed as a relic of a bygone era. In the frantic, terrified light of my phone, he was the only sane thing in a world that had tilted into madness. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice cracking, all my authority, all my wealth utterly meaningless. He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a deep ancestral dread. "There is nothing to do, Aknha. You cannot fight the sea. You cannot bargain with a memory. You can only pray she is merciful." Then a sound that broke through the whispers and the scratching, a loud, sharp crack. I whipped the flashlight beam towards the sound. Near the top of the enormous pane of glass, a hairline fracture had appeared, a silver spider web spreading in the darkness. And through the crack, a single black, oily trickle of seawater began to seep in, defying gravity, crawling down the inside of the glass. It carried with it the scent of the deep ocean, of decay, and of jasmine. The siege was over. The invasion had begun. The crack in the glass was a mouth, and it was weeping the black tears of the ocean into my home. The trickle became a stream, snaking down the pane, leaving a dark, greasy stain. It pooled on the pristine marble floor, the puddle spreading like a growing shadow. A single, perfect frangipani flower slid through the crack and fell into the pool of water, floating on the surface like a fallen star in a patch of night sky. "We have to get away from the glass," Ta Sorn hissed, pulling at my arm. He dragged me deeper into the house, towards the central corridor, the only part of the villa that had solid, concrete walls. It was a narrow, dark space, a spine of stability in a house made of fragile transparency. The sounds from the main room grew louder, more violent. The gentle scratching was replaced by a hard, rhythmic pounding. It wasn't the sound of fists. It was a wet, heavy sound, like the ocean itself was throwing its weight against my house. The entire villa shuddered with each impact. The floor vibrated, and I could hear the groaning of stressed steel beams in the ceiling. "She is angry now," Ta Sorn mumbled, his back pressed against the wall. He had his eyes squeezed shut, his hands steepled in a desperate prayer. He was chanting softly in Khmer, a string of pleas to spirits and ancestors I had long since forgotten how to name. I, on the other hand, couldn't close my eyes. My terror was a paralytic, but it demanded a witness. I peered around the edge of the corridor wall, my phone's flashlight beam shaking uncontrollably. The glass wall was no longer transparent. It was awash with churning black water, the shapes of the waves pressing against it, distorting the bruised twilight outside into a horrifying liquid kaleidoscope. More cracks were appearing, spreading like lightning flashes across the pane. The handprints were gone, replaced by the full, terrifying press of the storm. The whispers were a roar now, a symphony of grief and rage that filled every inch of the house. And in that roar, the lullaby was still there, a clear, piercing thread of sound, a mother's song twisted into a curse. I saw a shape in the water pressed against the glass, a human shape, vague, indistinct, made of shadow and sea foam and the deepest black of the ocean. Long hair flowed around it like seaweed in a current. It had no face that I could see, just a suggestion of one, a place where features should be, but there was only a swirling vortex of darkness. My mind finally broke. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. The shape outside seemed to react to my scream. It recoiled for a moment, and then it lunged. The pounding intensified, the entire wall of glass bowing inwards with a sickening groan. "Aknha, do you remember her?" Ta Sorn's voice cut through my panic. He had stopped praying and was looking at me, his eyes wide and urgent. "Remember who?" I yelled over the din. "The old woman, the woman who tended the shrine, the one who pleaded with your foreman on the day of the clearing." The memory, buried under years of business deals and relentless ambition, surfaced with brutal clarity. A tiny, stooped woman with a face like a dried riverbed, her hands clasped in a desperate plea. She had offered them everything she had, a few thousand riel, a basket of mangoes, if they would just spare the tree and the little house beneath it. My foreman had laughed, shooed her away like a stray dog, and signaled the bulldozer driver. I had watched it all from the air-conditioned comfort of my Land Cruiser, annoyed at the delay. I remember the sound the ancient banyan tree made as it was torn from the earth, its roots snapping like giant bones. I remember the small spirit house being crushed under the bulldozer's treads, splintering into nothing. And I remember the old woman letting out a single, piercing wail of despair before she fell to her knees, silent. "Her name was Pen," Ta Sorn said, his voice trembling. "She was the caretaker. Her family had watched over the Neek Ta for generations. They said she was a part of the spirit and the spirit was a part of her. When you destroyed its home, you broke her heart. She passed away a week later. They said she simply faded, gave up." The face of the old woman, contorted in grief, superimposed itself over the formless shape in the water. The lamenting whispers took on her voice. The lullaby was a song she used to hum while she swept the leaves around the shrine. It wasn't just the Neek Ta, the ancient spirit of the land. It was her, the old woman. Her grief had merged with the spirit's power, fueling it, directing it. This wasn't just a spirit reclaiming its land. This was a human heart, broken by my carelessness, demanding to be heard. "I didn't know," I choked out, the words tasting like ash. "It was just business." "To you it was dirt," Ta Sorn whispered. "To her it was the whole world." A final, deafening crack echoed through the house, followed by the catastrophic sound of shattering glass. It was a sound like the world's biggest chandelier falling onto a marble floor. A tidal wave of black water, frangipani flowers, and jagged shards of tempered glass exploded into my living room. The wave slammed into me, cold and impossibly strong. It threw me back against the corridor wall, the breath knocked from my lungs. The water was everywhere, oily and freezing, pulling at my clothes, filling my nose and mouth with the taste of salt and jasmine. My phone was torn from my grasp, its light extinguished as it was swallowed by the churning water. I was in absolute darkness, submerged in a roaring, chaotic sea that had once been my home. I flailed, disoriented, my hands searching for purchase. I felt Ta Sorn's hand grab my arm for a second, then it was gone, lost in the torrent. The water was pulling me, dragging me out towards the shattered wall and the raging storm beyond. I was drowning in my own living room. As my lungs began to burn and the darkness behind my eyes began to sparkle with dying lights, I felt something wrap around my ankle. It wasn't debris. It was soft and strong, like thick strands of silk. I knew, with the last shred of my consciousness, that it was hair. Her hair. She had me. The spirit of the shore, the ghost of a forgotten old woman, was pulling me into her embrace. The whispers were no longer outside me. They were inside my head, 1,000 voices speaking as one. "You took my home," they said with infinite sadness. "So now you will be my home." The world dissolved into a cold, black, jasmine-scented nothing. I woke up coughing, my lungs on fire. I was spitting out a vile mixture of salt water and sand. My body ached as if I'd been trampled. I was lying face down, not on my marble floor, but on wet grass. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. Dawn was breaking. The sky was a soft, bruised gray streaked with pink. The unnatural storm was gone. The wind was just a gentle coastal breeze, and the sea was calm, its waves lapping peacefully at the shore. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. But the evidence was all around me. My villa was a ruin. The entire sea-facing wall of glass was gone, leaving a gaping wound. The interior was gutted, filled with a deep layer of sand, seaweed, and debris. My expensive furniture was smashed to pieces or washed away entirely. It looked like a tsunami had hit it directly. And the flowers. My God, the flowers. The entire lawn, the patio, the sand-filled living room, everything was covered in a thick, pristine carpet of white frangipanis. They were untouched by the violence of the night, a beautiful, serene blanket over a scene of total devastation. The cloying smell of jasmine was still thick in the air. I staggered to my feet, my legs shaking. I called out, my voice a raw croak. "Ta Sorn, Ta Sorn." There was no answer. I searched frantically through the wreckage, my hope dwindling with every step. I found him near the back of the house, half buried in sand, tangled in the remains of a priceless Persian rug. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. There was no mark on him, no injury I could see. But he was gone. On his chest, placed with gentle care, was a single, perfect frangipani flower. He had tried to help me, and the sea had taken him too. A wave of guilt and grief so profound it brought me to my knees, washed over me. This was my fault. His death, this destruction, it was all my doing. The price of a plot of land, the cost of my progress. I stumbled out of the ruined villa, away from the wreckage, away from Ta Sorn's vacant stare. I walked down to the beach, my feet sinking into the wet sand. The line of the tide was littered with more flowers. The sea was giving back its dead. I stood there for hours as the sun rose higher, a lonely figure on a ruined coast. The authorities would come. There would be questions, insurance claims, reports to file. A new world of practical problems was waiting for me, but none of it mattered. The man who had lived in that villa, Akhnadara, the titan of industry, was gone. He had drowned last night in his living room. I was just the shell that was left behind. Eventually, I made my way back to what was left of my bedroom. Most of it was destroyed, but one corner remained relatively intact. A large piece of the mirrored wardrobe door was still hanging on its hinges, cracked but reflective. I looked at my own reflection. I saw a hollow-eyed stranger. His face streaked with grime, his expensive clothes torn and soaked. But it was something behind my reflection that made my breath catch in my throat. There on the pillow of my bed, the one part of the room untouched by the water and sand, lay a single frangipani flower. White, with a yellow heart, impossibly fresh. It hadn't washed in, it couldn't have. The whispers from the storm were gone from the wind. I knew this because I could hear them now, faint but clear, in the quiet, empty spaces of my own mind. It wasn't a roar anymore. It was a soft, constant murmur, a lullaby, her lullaby. She hadn't dragged me out to sea. She hadn't killed me. She had done exactly what she said she would. I had taken her home, the small house of wood and faith beneath the banyan tree. So she had taken mine. Not the villa of glass and steel. That was just a shell. She had taken the home inside my head. I live in Phnom Penh now, in a high-rise apartment, as far from the sea as I can get. I sold the land in Kep for a pittance. They say no one will build there, that the locals tell stories of a whispering wind, and a tide that leaves offerings of flowers on the sand. But distance doesn't matter. I am never alone. In the quiet of the night, I hear her, a soft, sorrowful humming. When I close my eyes, I see waves crawling up a dark beach. And every morning, without fail, I wake to the faint, sweet scent of jasmine, and I know, without having to look, that a single, fresh frangipani flower will be on the pillow beside me. An offering, a reminder, a claim. So I am telling you this, not for sympathy, not for forgiveness. I am beyond that. I am telling you this as a warning. Be careful what ground you break. Be careful which voices you choose to ignore. There are older contracts than the ones written on paper, and there are debts that cannot be paid with money. Some spirits don't want vengeance, they just want a home, and they will find one in the empty spaces you carve out with your greed. Listen, can you hear that? The whisper on the edge of the silence. She's always listening too, waiting.